So as we begin this week 2 of our study of developing leaders and cultivating partnership, I want to focus particularly on the topic of adaptive leadership, which we'll be studying over the next few weeks and particularly during our intensive week. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to get to know you and some of your own leadership story. We might reflect together as we have on all of those things that have shaped and formed us as leaders. Our own experiences of observing leaders, our own experiences throughout our life journey of leading, and our own experience of the context in which leadership occurs and what we've observed about leaders in our life, in our ministries, or various other organizations that we've interacted with over time. At the center of our leadership, whether we're aware of it or not, is our narrative. We might see that center, just as in this clay pot, as that which orients our leadership in a particular way. Our narrative is shaped and formed by some of our experiences, but our narrative also can be recomposed throughout our experience as a leader. Some of us shared in the forum some of the things that we've carried forward into our leadership narrative from some of our formative experiences, a child or youth. Someone has said, if you want to do it right, do it yourself, a kind of an echo from their own father that can also be something that we hold on to constructively or not so constructively, even now at this point in our lives. Others have said that I don't simply obey someone in a position of leadership because they have the experience of noticing that someone in a position does not necessarily demonstrate leadership. We're going to explore this a little bit further in today's video to kind of refine and give ourselves some more nuances around studying leadership in ways that might be distinctly different than some of what we've understood leadership to be. Maybe leadership is not just the position that someone has or the role that someone has. Maybe leadership is in fact a certain kind of activity. So let's recognize that in our own lives that we oftentimes want to make differences through how we lead. So we want to reflect on what differences do I actually want to make in my leadership position now, whether it be in a congregation or some other kind of organizational context. What are the differences I want to make leads to what are the actions, to a deeper reflection on the actions. Are my actions actually making the difference that I want to make? And do my actions bring out the best of myself, but they also bring out the best, do they also bring out the best in others? So these are kind of questions that I think help us evaluate and assess our leadership at different points along the way. And as we engage in our conversations, particularly from the writing assignment of this week leading into the case study that you'll be bringing to the intensive week, we'll have a better way to assess some of your own responses to these questions. But as a framework for understanding the differences, the differences that we want to make and why, the actions that we take and how, and the influence that we might have on others, I want to introduce some of the perspectives around adaptive leadership that maybe you've begun to explore in the text by Heifetz and others. So the artistry of adaptive leadership can feel sloppy and dangerous at times, but because of that, it's risky for us to sometimes engage in the act of leadership because we're not so sure that we're going to be able to lead in a way in which we come out of that experience unscathed and unharmed. So let's look at what is adaptive leadership. So it is the ability to mobilize people to tackle tough challenges and to thrive. in less predictable and sometimes more ambiguous environments. So adaptive leadership, notice, is not just leading in times of certainty and familiarity. Adaptive leadership is the capacity to mobilize others to tackle challenges and to also thrive in environments that are less predictable and more ambiguous than the certainty that often we would like to have as a leader. So this is what provides the challenge of adaptive leadership. And usually anyone serving a congregation or any organization now can begin to identify what are those challenges and what are those less predictable and more ambiguous environments in which we deal with. As you know, the whole concept of adaptive leadership has been developed over time, primarily by Ron Heifetz and some of his colleagues at Harvard Business School. And so you see this line of books that's been developed. I particularly like the text that I've chosen for this class, The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, because it really does provide a kind of a workbook for you to help you apply these concepts to your own practices as a leader right now, in the here and now. Whereas the previous books were helpful but more theoretical. This particular book, I think, combines both practice and theory together. So adaptation is a natural process that organisms follow as they seek to survive and to thrive. Adaptation is part of life itself. And also the challenge of adaptive leadership in organizations often means that we have to find ways to preserve the critical DNA of that organization, to also remove or modify that which is no longer necessary or useful, and also to create or innovate new arrangements that enable the organization to thrive. So this is just another way of saying we want to carry through that which is of worth and in that organization that has been kind of a through line, that it's its own particular signature and DNA, but we also have to recognize in a changing and chaotic kind of environments in which most organizations live right now, we have to remove or modify that which is no longer useful at this particular developmental stage, this particular historical or cultural movement, and we have to, in whatever way we can, innovate and create new arrangements that enable that organization, that congregation to thrive. So there are some core principles that I think are useful for us to think about when we think about adaptive leadership. So the first principle is really there is no reason to exercise leadership unless there is something you really care deeply enough about to both preserve and to adapt. So you need to ask yourself, and I'll ask this question often, for the sake of what are you wanting to lead in this particular way in this organization? So having some clarity of purpose, as you see in the first chapters of the Heifetz book, are so important. And to be grounded in purpose, whether that purpose comes to you from a reading of the context of the organization, comes to you from a spiritual sense of call within that organization, or comes from some kind of combination of both. Leading for the sake of is so important in adaptive leadership. Otherwise, you can easily go adrift. So this does require that we have to have some clarity about what are the core purposes and the core values of this organization that, in spite of all the changes, require us to begin to adapt with a clear sense of why and for what reasons we're wanting to help the congregation adapt. Principle number 2 is that there really is no such thing as a dysfunctional organization, although many of us can give case studies to oppose that particular point of view. Every organization is perfectly aligned to achieve the results that it currently gets. So it may feel dysfunctional, but it's functioning in a particular way for a particular purpose, maybe a particular purpose in time. And at this point, at this juncture, it may very well be that the purposes for many of its functions have outlived their usefulness, and that's why we're needing to engage in a more adaptive kind of leadership process in that organization. So we might see, for example, that what seems like dysfunction are really creative, what I like to call signals of creative tensions. They can be tensions in the values within an organization. So an organization that was really built around acceptance might begin to recognize that it also needs some accountability. An organization that has thrived because of its sense of stability may also need to find its capacity to risk at this particular time and juncture in its life or its community. Organization that has been organized around serving those who find their way to us may have to adapt in such a way as to extend itself in service to those who are not already there within the walls of the congregation, serving one's membership or serving a mission. These are creative tensions that require oftentimes adaptive work. It's not an either or, it's a both and, as you probably know. So let's look at principle number 3. Principle number 3 is that adaptation occurs through experimentation, and it relies on the presence of diversity. In an adaptive leadership context, we're wanting to bring forth diversity of thought, diversity of experience, because in that diversity oftentimes is the seed of some kind of change or some kind of response that can help that congregation or organization move forward. And we want to create a culture of experimentation. We want to encourage an atmosphere in which diverse experiences and diverse perspectives can be heard in order to find a way forward. Principle number 4 is the most common cause, and this is a very important distinction, of failure in leadership is produced by treating adaptive challenges as if they were technical problems to be solved. And I think this requires us to explore this distinction a little bit further, because oftentimes we're trying to do quick fixes or trying to solve a problem that is not really a problem to solve, but it's a situation that needs to be adapted towards a process of learning and growth, that the solution of which is not currently known. Sometimes we've made the mistake that leadership means having a solution to the problem. And hopefully through adaptive leadership you can begin to understand. It means engaging in those activities that help bring forth adaptation, change, and learning within the organization that you're helping to serve, so that people can own the solutions that they come up with as experiments towards some new change, some new... Perhaps at this point it would be good to give an example. So say, for example, the leadership challenge is evangelism. How does a congregation in this day and age evangelize in a way that allows it to be more outwardly focused rather than inwardly focused? And what does evangelism, that E word that is an allergy for many congregations, actually mean for the contemporary congregation? So one way to take a technical approach to evangelism would be to just have a welcome table and a welcome center, and assume that in and of itself will create the kind of evangelism, take care of it, solve that problem. The idea, of course, is you come to us. Rather than an adaptive approach, is to say, well, let's do and invite a friend to church Sunday. So that's taking a specific kind of strategy and saying, okay, we're going to apply this to the whole issue of evangelism. Nothing wrong with that, but that is just a one-shot deal that does not necessarily bring about the kind of growth or change or adaptation that might actually be required. So if we're to look at that particular one, there's certainly some adaptive dimensions to it as well, because if members of the congregation don't know how to reach out to others to actually invite them to their congregation, then they have to adapt, figure out how do they, in a sense, use a relational approach to actually go about inviting a friend to church on a Sunday. So you see here a combination of a technical approach would be just to say we're going to have an invite a friend to church Sunday. A technical and adaptive approach would be, in addition to having the invite a friend, to also engage in whatever activities you might have to engage in to help people prepare to actually be able to invite a friend to church. So to treat it as an adaptive challenge, however, takes it to a whole other level. And that's to create a culture in which people can begin to feel comfortable telling and sharing their own faith stories. So this is the adaptive challenges, creating that kind of learning and change and adaptation that allows people to feel comfortable about sharing their own faith and do it in such a way that is adapted to the kind of times in which we live, that will allow them to feel comfortable, would also allow them to find a way to do it that feels like it has some integrity for who it is that they are. So most of our leadership challenges are these kind of bundles of technical problems and adaptive challenges. So what if, and finally let me just do this, principle 5, leadership's not the same thing as authority. I saw that in some of the forum comments, trying to make that distinction between someone who has authority because of their role and also someone who exercises leadership. In our day and age, we have great examples of how the two do not necessarily equate with one another. So what if we thought of leadership really as a verb and not as a noun, and begin to look at what are those practices that engage someone in the actual capacity of leading rather than just having the role as a leader. So part of our exploration over this next week and through the intensive week will be to look at leadership as a practice. So let's talk about your writing assignment. What I'd like you to do is to follow your reading of Hyphus and viewing the video. Begin to introduce an adaptive challenge in your own ministry or leadership setting. One that feels significant, and most importantly, one that you feel that you really care enough about to have it be your focus, at least during the intensive week. It might change or shift during the intensive week, but think of something that you care about. And so remember that earlier question, for the sake of what do you want to be engaged in this particular adaptive challenge? And then post that on the forum. You might allow yourself to give it a title, so that we have a sense of what that adaptive challenge is just from the subject line in the discussion thread. And I gave a few examples. My adaptive challenge, connecting with our broader community, or my adaptive challenge, getting water from the rock. Send me also a copy as an attached document so that I can keep all of these together for our intensive week, for my own records. And you bring this along with yourself as well. So we'll engage with one another, and all I'm asking you to do this week is to have a dialogue with at least one other person about their adaptive challenge. But resist the tendency to try to solve their problem. Don't offer solutions or quick fixes. Instead, ask curious questions, or for more details about the situation or about your colleague's purpose. For example, what would you like to see happen? Or even make some curious statements such as, I wonder if, and you can figure out how to answer that sentence that really embodies and engages you in the curiosity that you actually have about their adaptive challenge. Or ask questions of each other that probe into what are some of the actual adaptive aspects of this challenge, those that require learning. those that require a shift in perspective and not just practices, those that require real change or adaptation. So this is our focus for the week, and I want you to begin to think about your own leadership practices. What are some differences that you want to make? You might even take these as journal questions. Are your actions really making a difference that you're wanting to make? And do your actions bring out the best in yourself and in others? You're going to take the leadership practices inventory, which is included in this week's module, but you don't have to finish it this week. You can just bring it with you to the intensive week. You'll see the instructions, score it ahead of time, bring that along with you. And then as part of our intensive week, I want you to prepare by reading some of the selections that are in the assignments for this week from Deborah Jackson's book, Spiritual Practices for Effective Leadership, the 7 R's of Sanctuary for Pastors. Deborah Jackson, who's a colleague and a friend of mine, will be joining us in a video conference on the Wednesday of our intensive week. And so it'd be good if you could get acquainted with some of the book and also reflect on some of your key learnings and maybe some questions or reflections that you'd like to add to the conversation with Deborah. Horizon for that congregation.